February 14, 1945. American B-17 bombers were supposed to be flying toward Germany. Their target was the rail yards of Dresden, a key transportation hub feeding the Nazi war machine. Instead, through heavy cloud cover and faulty navigation, they released their bombs over Prague, a city that was not on the target list, a city filled with civilians. Within minutes, buildings collapsed. Fires spread across residential neighborhoods. More than 700 people were killed. For years, many believed it was intentional. It wasn't. It was a navigational error made in the final months of World War II. But for the people on the ground, the reason didn't matter. February 14, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final violent phase. The Western Allies were pushing from the west. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Germany was collapsing, but it was still fighting hard. The previous night, British bombers had devastated Dresden in one of the most controversial air raids of the war. The city's rail yards, bridges, and industrial centers were considered vital to moving German troops toward the Eastern Front. The next wave would come from the Americans. That morning, heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force lifted off from airfields in England. Among them were B-17 Flying Fortresses, 4-engine aircraft capable of carrying massive bomb loads deep into enemy territory. Their assigned target? Rail infrastructure near Dresden. Rail lines mattered. In early 1945, the German military depended on rail transport more than ever. Fuel shortages limited truck movement. Bridges and rail yards were strategic choke points. Destroy the rails, slow the war machine. That was the logic. The formation climbed into thick winter cloud cover. Navigation in 1945 was not satellite-guided. Crews relied on dead reckoning, radio beacons, maps, wind calculations, and visual landmarks. If weather interfered, precision suffered. Over Central Europe, the skies were unstable. Cloud layers obscured rivers and city outlines. Bombardiers depended on brief breaks in visibility to confirm targets. Inside the lead aircraft, the bombardier lay prone over his Norden bomb sight. The device was considered one of America's most advanced wartime technologies, capable, under ideal conditions, of remarkable accuracy. But ideal conditions rarely existed in February over Europe. Wind drift calculations had to be precise. Speed had to be steady. Course corrections had to be exact. A small deviation at high altitude could shift a bomb load miles off target. Somewhere along the route, the formation drifted. Later analysis would suggest a combination of factors: strong crosswinds, poor visibility, radio navigation limitations, similar river patterns between Dresden and Prague. Below the clouds, two major European cities sat along winding rivers, the Elbe and the Vltava. From altitude, through partial breaks in cloud, misidentification was possible. The crews believed they were approaching Dresden. They were not. Shortly before noon, bombs began to fall. Explosive loads dropped through the cloud cover toward a city that had not been designated as a target. The city was Prague. At that moment, Prague was part of the German-occupied protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Though under Nazi control since 1939, it was not considered a primary industrial bombing objective by U.S. planners in February 1945. The American airmen did not intend to strike Prague's historic districts. They believed they were striking German rail lines supporting the war effort. But bombs do not correct mistakes once released. On the ground, it began without warning. Air raid sirens were not fully prepared for an American formation that was never expected. Civilians looked up to see aircraft silhouettes emerging between clouds. Some assumed the planes were German. Then the explosions started. Residential neighborhoods were hit. Historic buildings suffered damage. Streets filled with dust, shattered masonry and smoke. Church towers shook. Windows imploded outward. Roofs collapsed into apartments below. The attack lasted only minutes. But in those minutes, entire blocks were transformed. Estimates vary slightly, but more than 700 civilians were killed. Over 1,000 were injured. Thousands were left without homes. For Prague's residents, the shock was profound. The war had brought occupation, repression, fear, but not large-scale Allied bombing. That had been Germany's burden. Until now. The bombs that fell that day came from aircraft marked with American insignia. Inside the bombers, crews likely saw only smoke columns rising through broken cloud. Many believed the mission had succeeded. Bomb damage assessment in 1945 was not instantaneous. There was no live video confirmation. Reports would be filed later. Reconnaissance photography would be analyzed days afterward. It was only after mission debriefings and post-flight intelligence reviews that something seemed wrong. Coordinates didn't align perfectly. Weather reports complicated verification. Questions began to circulate quietly. Had the formation missed Dresden? Had crosswinds pushed them farther south? Had navigation equipment malfunctioned? Within Allied command, there was no intention to strike Prague deliberately on February 14th. But in war, intention does not erase outcome. Meanwhile, German propaganda moved quickly. State-controlled broadcasts accused the Americans of intentionally bombing a historic European city filled with civilians. Newspapers framed it as proof that the Allies were no better than the regime they fought. For Prague's residents, the political narrative mattered less than the funerals. Bodies were pulled from rubble for days. Families searched hospitals for missing relatives. Historic landmarks that had survived centuries of European conflict now bore fresh scars. The irony was bitter. The bombing of Dresden, occurring simultaneously, would become one of the most debated Allied air operations of the war. But Prague's bombing, smaller in scale yet devastating locally, would exist in a gray space. Too accidental to frame as strategy, too deadly to dismiss as minor. And it happened in the final months of a war already turning toward Allied victory. For the American airmen, February 14th was one mission among many. Crews had flown dozens of sorties under extreme danger. Anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and German fighters remained constant threats. Most believed they were striking legitimate military targets. None lifted off intending to bomb Prague's civilians. But history often records consequences more loudly than intentions. And in Prague, February 14, 1945, became a day when American bombs fell on the wrong city. This was not an act of calculated destruction. It was a navigational mistake. But it was a mistake measured in lives. In the days that followed the bombing, the first challenge was simple: count the dead. But even that was not straightforward. Buildings had collapsed inward. Entire families were buried beneath stone and timber. Some victims were never formally identified. Others died later from injuries in overcrowded hospitals. Early local estimates placed the death toll in the hundreds. Later investigations would confirm that more than 700 civilians were killed. Some records list 701, others slightly higher. Over 1,000 were injured. Thousands were displaced. In a war that had consumed millions of lives, the number may have seemed small on a strategic map. But in Prague, it was devastating. The bombing struck several districts, including residential neighborhoods and historic areas of the city. Unlike industrial targets, these were not military installations, they were homes. German authorities reacted immediately. Nazi-controlled media in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia broadcast images of destroyed buildings and civilian funerals. They framed the bombing as proof that the Allies were indiscriminate, no better than the regime they claimed to fight. Posters appeared condemning American terror bombing. For the occupying regime, the tragedy was propaganda gold. Yet beneath the propaganda was a more complicated truth. Prague had been under German control since 1939. Czech resistance movements operated in secret. Many citizens quietly hoped for Allied victory. Now, American bombs had killed Czech civilians living under Nazi occupation. Liberation and destruction had collided. In Washington and London, the incident did not dominate headlines. The strategic bombing campaign over Germany was intense. Multiple cities were struck daily. Casualty reports flowed constantly. Military planners focused on rail lines, oil refineries, and troop movements. The Prague bombing was recorded as an operational error. It did not trigger public outrage in the United States. There were no front-page apologies, no dramatic speeches. The war machine moved forward. Privately, Allied officials acknowledged the mistake. Navigation in heavy winter cloud cover had led to misidentification. The intended target had been Dresden. Crosswinds and poor visibility shifted the formation. The explanation was technical, but technical explanations rarely comfort grieving families. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Prague rose up in open revolt against remaining German forces during the Prague Uprising. Within days, Soviet troops entered the city. American ground forces, though advancing through western Czechoslovakia, did not liberate Prague itself. That geopolitical reality added another layer of complexity. The city, bombed by American aircraft, would ultimately be entered by the Red Army. And soon, Czechoslovakia would fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. For decades during the Cold War, the February 14 bombing was remembered differently on each side of the Iron Curtain. In communist Czechoslovakia, it was often cited as an example of Western aggression or recklessness. In the United States, it remained largely unknown, a minor footnote in the broader air war. It did not fit neatly into narratives of heroism or liberation. It was neither a decisive victory nor a deliberate atrocity. It was a mistake, and mistakes are harder to memorialize. Today, historians largely agree on the central facts. The bombing of Prague on February 14, 1945, was unintended. The intended target was Dresden. The misidentification likely resulted from weather conditions and navigational drift. More than 700 civilians died. But historical agreement does not erase memory. In Prague, plaques mark the locations where bombs struck. Names are remembered locally. The event lives quietly in the city's historical record. War compresses decision-making into seconds. From 20,000 feet above cloud cover, rivers look similar. City outlines blur. Wind pushes aircraft off course. On the ground, consequences are permanent. The American crews that day were following orders. They believed they were striking a legitimate military objective. But on February 14, 1945, the war touched Prague in a way it was never meant to. And for the civilians beneath those bombers, intent did not change impact. By mid-February 1945, the outcome of the war in Europe was no longer in doubt. Germany was collapsing. Allied armies were crossing the Rhine. Soviet forces were pushing relentlessly toward Berlin. The air war had become relentless. Every day, American bombers launched from England toward rail hubs, oil refineries, bridges, and industrial centers. The objective was clear: cripple what remained of the Nazi war machine and shorten the war. In that environment, missions were calculated in strategic value. Targets were coordinates, cities were shapes on maps, and sometimes the margin of error was measured in miles. The bombing of Prague did not change the course of the war. It did not alter military strategy. It did not shift front lines. But it revealed something uncomfortable about modern warfare. Even with advanced technology for its time, even with trained crews and precise planning, war is still vulnerable to human limitation. Wind, cloud, navigation drift, assumption. Small factors at high altitude can produce irreversible consequences below. In post-war reviews, American officials maintained the same position. The intended target had been Dresden. The bombing of Prague was accidental. There was no deliberate decision to strike the Czech capital. Historians across multiple countries largely agree with that assessment. There is no evidence of a planned attack on Prague that day. But history is not judged only by documents. It is remembered by those who lived through it. For many Prague families, February 14, 1945, was not an abstract wartime error. It was the day a parent did not come home, the day a child was buried, the day an apartment block collapsed. The city would survive. The war would end. Nazi occupation would fall. But scars, physical and emotional, remained. In the United States, the incident remained little known for decades. World War II is often remembered through its decisive victories: Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of Western Europe. Stories that complicate the narrative tend to fade. The bombing of Prague sits in that space. It was not a war crime. It was not a strategic triumph. It was an unintended tragedy during a total war that had already consumed the world. There is a tendency to view war in clean lines: right and wrong, victory and defeat, liberator and aggressor. But history is rarely that simple. The same nation that helped defeat Nazi Germany also made mistakes along the way. The same air crews who risked their lives over hostile skies could not see clearly through winter cloud. And in February 1945, that blindness cost lives in a city that was never meant to be a target. War compresses complexity into seconds. Bombs are released, engines roar, aircraft turn for home. On the ground, consequences unfold for years. When we study World War II, we often focus on turning points and triumphs, but understanding the war fully requires acknowledging its imperfections, even on the Allied side. Not to diminish sacrifice, not to rewrite history, but to recognize that even just causes are carried out by human hands, and humans can be wrong. On February 14, 1945, American bombers aimed for Dresden. Instead, they struck Prague. It was not intentional, but it was real. And history remembers both victories and mistakes, even when one overshadows the other.